On the day that followed, they crossed a lake of gypsum so fine the ponies left no track upon it. The riders wore masks of bone black, smeared about their eyes, and some had blacked the eyes off their horses. The sun reflected off the pan burned the undersides of their faces, and shadow of horse and rider alike were painted upon the fine white powder in purest indigo. Far out on the desert, to the north dust spouts rose wobbling and augured the earth. And some said they'd heard off pilgrims, borne aloft like dervishes in those mindless coils, to be dropped, broken and bleeding goop in the desert again, and there perhaps to watch the thing that had destroyed them lurch and work like some drunken djinn, and resolve itself once more into the elements from which it sprang. Out of that whirlwind no voice spoke, and the pilgrim lying in his broken bones may cry out, and in his anguish he may rage. But rage at what? And if the dried and blackened shell Ophim is found among the sands by travelers to come yet, who can discover the engine of his ruin? That night they sat at the fire like ghosts in their dusty beards and clothing, wrapped. Pyratrus the fires died, and small coals scampered down the plain, and sand crept past in the dark all night like armies of lice on the move. In the night, some of the horses began to scream, and daybreak found several so crazed with snow blindness they required to be shot. When they rode out the Mexican they called, McGill was on his third horse in as many days. He could not have blacked eyes of the pony he'd ridden coming up from the dry lake, short of muzzling it like a dog and the horse. He now rode was wilder yet, and there were only 3 animals left in the caballado. That afternoon, the 2 bellows that had left them a day out of Janos caught them up where they nooned a mineral well. They had with them the veteran's horse, still saddled. Clanton walked out to where the animal stood and took up the trailing reins and led it to the fire, where he removed the rifle from the scabbard and handed it to David Brown, and then began to go through the wallet strapped to the cantle and to pitch the veteran's meager effects into the fire. He undid the girth straps and loosed the other accoutrements and piled them onto the flames. Blankets, saddle, all the greasy wool and leather, sending up a foul gray smoke. Then they rode on. They were moving north, and for 2 days the Delawares read the smoke's on distant peaks, and then the smoke stopped, and there were no more. As they entered the Futhals, they came upon a dusty old diligence, with 6 horses in the traces grazing, the dry grass in a fold, among the barren scrag. A deputation cut for the carriage, and the horses jerked their heads and shied, and went trotting. The riders harried them about the basin until they were circling like paper horses in a wind trap, and the diligence rattling after with 1 broken wheel. The black walked out, waving his hat, and called them off, and he approached the yoked horses with the hat outheld, and talked to them where they stood trembling until he could reach the trailing straps. Glanton walked past him and opened the carriage door. The inside of the coach was splintered up with new wood, and a dead man slumped out and hung head down. There was another man inside, and a young boy, and they lay in Hearst with their weapons in his stink. To drive a buzzard off a gut cart, Glanton took the guns and ammunition and handed them out. 2 men climbed Bedtoe, the freight deck, and cut away the ropes and the tattered tarp, and they kicked down a steamer trunk and an old rawhide dispatch box and broke them open. Glanton cut the straps on the dispatch box with his knife and tipped the box out in the sand. Letters penned for any destination save here began to skitter and drift away down the canyon. There were a few tagged bags of ore samples in the box, and he emptied them on the ground and kicked at the lumps 04 and looked about. He looked inside the coach again, and then he spat and turned and looked at the horses over. They were big American horses, but badly used up. He directed two of them, cut out of the traces, and then he waved the black away from the lead horse and wafted his hat at animals. They set off down the floor of the canyon, mismatched and sawing in the harness, the diligence swaying on its leather springs and the dead man dangling out of the clapping door. They diminished upon the plain to the west first, the sound, and then the shape of them dissolving in the heat rising off the sand until they were no more than a mote struggling in that hallucinatory void, and then nothing at all. The riders rode. On all afternoon, they rode single file up the row. The mountains, a small gray laneret flew about them, as if seeking their banner, and then it shied away over the plain below on its slender falcon wings. They rode on through sandstone cities in the dusk of that day, past castle and keep and wind-fashioned watchtower, and stone granaries in sun and in shadow. They rode through marland terracotta and rifts of copper shale, and they rode through a wooded swag and out upon a promontory overlooking a bleak and barren caldera where lay the abandoned ruins of Santa Rita del Cabra. Here they made a dry and fireless camp. They sent down scouts, and Glanton walked out on Thebluff and sat in the dusk, watching the darkness deepen in the gulf below to see if any light should show itself down there. The scouting party returned in the dark, and it was still dark in morning when the company mounted and rode out. They entered the caldera in a condition of half-gray dawn, riding single file through the shaly streets between rows of old adobes, abandoned these dozen years past when the Apaches cut off wagon trains from Chihuahua and laid the works under siege. The starving Mexicans had set out afoot on the long journey south, but none ever arrived. The Americans rode past the slag and drubble and the dark shapes of shaft mouths, and they rode past the smelting house where piles of ore stood about and weathered, wagons and ore carts bone white in the dawn, and the dark iron shapes of abandoned machinery. They crossed the stony arroyo and rode on through that gutted terrain to a slight rise where sat the old Presidio, a large triangular building of adobe with round towers at the corners. There was a single door in the east wall, and as they approached, they could see rising the smoke that they had smelled on the morning air. Glanton pounded on the door, with his rohita-covered club like a traveler at an inn. A bluish light suffused the hills about, and the tallest peaks to the north stood in the only sun, while all the caldera lay in darkness yet. The echo of his knocking clapped about the stark and riven walls off-rack and returned. The men sat there. Horses Glanton gave the door a kick. "Come out if you're white," he called. "Who's there?" called a voice. Glanton spat, "Who is it?" "They called Dot, open it," said Glanton. They waited. Chains were drawn rattling across the wood. The tall door creaked inward, and Eamon stood before them at the ready with a rifle. Glanton touched his horse with his knee, and they traced its head along the door and forced it open, and they rode through Dot in the gray murk. Within the compound they dismounted and tied. A few old freight wagons stood about, some looted of their wheels by travelers. There was a lamp burning in one of Theophas's, and several men stood in the door. Glanton crossed the triangle. The men stepped aside. "We thought you was Injuns Day," said they were 4 left out of a party of 7 that had set out for the mountains to prospect for precious metals. They had been barricaded in the old Presidio for 3 days, fled here from Thiezer to the south, pursued by the savages. One of the men was shot through the lower chest end. He lay propped against the wall in the office. Irving came in and looked at him. "What have you done for him?" he said. "Ain't done nothing." "What do you want me to do for him?" "Ain't asked you to do nothing." "That's good," said Irving, "because there ain't nothing to be done." He looked at them. They were foul and ragged and half-crazed. They'd been making forays at night. up the arroyo for wood and water, and they had been feeding off a dead mule that lay legged and stinking in the far corner of the yard. The first thing they asked for was whiskey handy. Next was tobacco. They had but 2 animals, and one of these had been snake-bit and theatsered, and this thing now stood in the compound, with its head, enormously swollen and grotesque like some fabled equine ideation out of an attic tragedy. It had been bitten on thin, and its eyes bulged out of the shapeless head in a horror of agony, and it tottered moaning toward the clustered horses of the company, with its long, misshapen muzzle swinging and drooling, and its breath wheezing in the throttled pipes of its throat. The skin had split open along the bridge of its nose, and the bone shone through pinkish white, and its small ears looked like paper spills twisted into either side of a hairy loaf of dough. The American horses began tumble and separate along the wall at its approach, and it swung after them blindly. There was a flurry of thumps and kicks, and the horses began to circle the compound. A small mottled stallion belonging to one of the Delawares came out of the remuda and struck at the thing, twice stunned, then turned and buried its teeth in its neck. Out of the mad horse's throat came a sound that brought the men to the door.